Title of the film: Missing Voices, Voices of Disabled Roma in the UK. Next slide says, this study was funded by the National Lottery as part of the Disability Research into Independent Living and Learning Program for Disabled People, the DRILL program. The study was carried out in partnership by the University of Worcester and Shaping Our Lives. There are 4 logos that are found at the bottom of the slide. Next slide says, the family is walking in through a wooden door, smiling and walking in to sit down. The slide has text overlaid on top of the image of the families walking in. The text says, all the families in the video are from Slovakia and have recent experience of English health and social services. Next slide says, Ladislav is 17 years old, is accompanied by his mother. They are Slovakian Roma living in Sheffield, UK. Next slide says, Ladislav has a mental health disability and relies on his family for all of his basic needs. The next slide, we see a woman with a white coat and a navy top with pink flowers. She has her dark hair pulled back and is wearing golden earrings with rubies inside. There is a black poster in the background on the left-hand side, and it has a small corner with the yellow and black lines on it. My name is Dorina Horvatova. I am 33 years old. I have 6 children. I'm from Žara. Next slide. We see Dorina and Ladislav sitting side by side. He is wearing a black coat and has short dark hair. There are several posters in the background. Dorina speaks. This is my son, Ladislav Horvat. He is 17. Next slide says, from the age of 2 until Ladislav turned 12, the family was not able to get any support from their home country, therefore they decided to come abroad. Next slide. Who has helped you? Do you have a support network? Next slide. We see Dorina. We went to the doctors. The school helped us too. The school helped us completing the forms, and that was it. Next slide says, who helped you complete the necessary documents for him? We see Dorina. We've got an uncle who speaks English and he helped us. Next slide says, do you go to any other places when you need help? Next slide. We see Dorina and Ladislav sitting side by side. We go to our doctor, for example, and very often there is an interpreter there that is keen to help us. Dorina turns to Ladislav and asks him if he wants to say anything. And he says, I dance. I am happy when I dance. Next slide says, Christina Horvatova is a 60-year-old Slovakian woman who is living in Sheffield, UK. She has mobility issues and other health-related problems. Next slide, we see an older woman with a red cardigan and she is wearing a black and white striped top. She has gold earrings with a ruby stone. There is a black poster in the background on the left-hand side, and it has a small corner with yellow and black lines. My name is Christina Horvatova, 60 years old. I am from Žara. I came in England 4 years ago. My children are helping me. Next slide says, in your family, are there any other disabled people? Next slide, we see Christina again. In my daughter's family, Blažena's family, we have Ladislav who's got problems. We did a lot of work. It was really hard for us. We traveled to Bratislava for a year to go to the hospital. Next slide. Tell us more about your disability. Next slide. We see Christina. I am not good. You know how it is. When you've got an illness, it's not easy to live like that. There are always issues, and I have to go to the doctor. I have constant pain on my legs. My children are coming with me to the appointments. I'm under treatment for my blood pressure and leg issues. I also take some medicine for my anxiety and stress. Next slide says, what are the activities you enjoy doing? Next slide. We see Christina. I often help my daughter-in-law with the housework. I can't do a lot of work due to my health condition and mobility needs. Next slide. Who is helping you when you are in pain? Next slide. We see Christina. My daughter-in-law is helping me. She gives me medicines. I then go to bed and feel better. Next slide. In the community, do you have any friends that help you? Next slide. We see Christina. I have my family, I have my brothers that are coming and visiting me, helping with what they can. Next slide. When you came to England, who helped you? We see Christina. When I first came, I was not well, so I registered with the doctor. I followed the instructions. They sent different referrals to the main hospital. They helped me with the sugar levels regarding my diabetes. I had to complete some forms related to disability, and then they asked me to go in a tribunal. I've been in tribunal to evidence that I have a disability. They gave me a walking stick. It helps me mainly when I climb the stairs. Next slide says, what do you do on a daily basis to forget about your pain? Next slide, we see Christina. I'm going to my brother. I'm visiting my family members. But sometimes I might not be in a mood to go due to the pain that I've got. And I also lost my husband. My legs and knees are always hurting me. Next slide says, Evelina Jorvatova is a 13-year-old girl who is joined by her mother, Blažena Horvatova. They are Slovakian Roma living in Sheffield, UK, and Evelina wears hearing aids. Next slide. We see Evelina seated and her hair is pulled back.
My name is Evelina Jorvatova. I come from Slovakia, and I'm 13 years old. My disability is for wearing hearing aids. I go to Meadowhead School in Norwegian. I like to school, like learning more about lessons like technology, math, English, arts. And I learn technology, how to cook, like they learn me how to cook in technology. And I really like cooking.
Next slide. Do you have friends to spend your time with?
I have 5 friends. One that come from Africa, and she's got same hearing aids problems like me. She normally speak like me. She's not really speaking English well as like me.
Next slide. How do you spend your free time?
I go home and I help my mom, and I learn my family how to speak English as well. When it's rain, we're not going nowhere. Like sometimes at night we're going out to eat like pancake, KFC, McDonald's, and ice skating.
Next slide. Tell us about your disability.
I wear hearing aids to hear better, and I normally not hear well. So when I don't wear my hearing aids, I couldn't hear better. even when I go to sleep, I wear them when I go to sleep because in the morning, when my mom wake me up and I couldn't hear what she's saying to me, like I'm normally going late to school because I really don't hear what my mom's just saying when I'm in the morning. So in 2018, I had my operation, my ears. So in my left ear, they put me a grommet in it so to hear me better, well, and because I had lower temperature, like I had lower, and I had my nose operation, so I could breathe well.
Next slide. How are you coping with your disability?
I find it really hard because, like, I really wear the hearing aids a lot. Like, I wear the hearing aid like 7 years, so I really tried it hard, so I couldn't do my best.
Next slide says, we see Evelina Jorvatova wearing a black jumper and a jean jacket. There is a poster in the background. My name is Evelina Jorvatova. I am 42 years old. I've got 10 children. I am from Slovakia. 3 of my children have hearing and speaking issues. This has been a massive issue in my family. There have been so many years they struggled with hearing impairment. This is something that's been in our family, so it's genetic. The disability is called hearing impairment in speech and language. Next slide. Who supported you and how are you managing these health issues with so many children? Next slide. Blažena is seated next to her daughter Evelina, and her daughter is watching her. So the professionals just told me where to go. They send me everywhere. The school told me first, you have to go to the doctors. And we had a doctor from the school, which is kind of a hearing impairment teacher. And actually, she was the person who helped us the most. She completed all the relevant forms. She taught us about the equipment and everything else. There was a doctor coming to our house, helping with my children's disabilities. But the government decided to cut the funds allocated to them, and this lady helped us prove that we needed to get those funds back. After she completed the forms, the funds were immediately transferred to our accounts. Next slide. What are your feelings about this situation? Next slide. Blažena is seated alone. I want to say that I am grateful to God that it is not worse. I am happy that she has got the support that she needed and that she is a healthy person, besides the hearing impairment, and grateful that we can enjoy this life. Next slide says, families seem to go to their local GPs for help and advice. So it's important that these services understand Roma culture and have information about local deaf and disabled people's organizations. The families in this video all seem to want to integrate with available mainstream services. The 3 families have different disabilities and each relies on their families, communities, social services, and schools for support. However, generalizations should not be made, and a local focus group of Roma people felt that they would only join TDPOs if they were run by members of their own community. The families are asked what advice they would give to other families with disability needs, and here is their advice. Each one says one line or one sentence. Come, I can help you. I can help them by going with them to the doctors or telling them which documents they need for the doctors. Go to the doctor. They will help you. I will tell them that I can't help them properly, but my daughter can help you as she can speak English very well and knows the services. I will tell them and guide them towards the community center or the local authority. Next slide says, we will now present some slides which give conclusions and recommendations from the research project. Next slide. The project will make recommendations to deaf and disabled people's organizations and community connector organizations about how best to include and advocate for disabled members of their Roma populations, including making information available in accessible formats. Next slide. There was a low level of interest shown in the Missing Voices project by deaf and disabled people's organizations, many of whom are struggling to survive in times of austerity. Next slide. There were mixed views across the Roma communities about where they would use mainstream deaf and disabled people's organizations as a way of having their missing voices heard. Two groups said they would, whereas another group said they would only want their own organizations run by and for their own people. Local customized solutions seemed the way forward. Next slide. Deaf and disabled people's organizations do not reach out proactively to disabled Roma people in their communities. None reported actually having Roma members, but most say, "Our doors are open to all," which does not facilitate inclusion. Next slide. Many Roma families in the UK seem to care for their own disabled members, partly through culture, but also because they do not know about local services, organizations, plus a fear of discrimination. Next slide says, cultural legacies of shame and stigma regarding disabled community members remained, with some evidence that such views were changing via exposure to the UK context. Next slide. The roles of community connectors, liaison-type staff employed by charities or government agencies who were sometimes from Roma communities, were seen by community members and the research team as critical links. In the main, however, the knowledge held by the community connectors about disability issues was patchy, and there was no specific guidance on disabled organizations' services available for Roma. Next slide. There were many comments about a lack of suitable interpreters and the difficulty in understanding concepts and terms relating to disability. The next slide says, many Roma families have come to the UK to find better employment conditions, but housing stock is primarily in the private sector and of poor quality. There were views expressed that landlords would not allow adaptations to accommodate disability. The next slide says, the project represented the first opportunity to hear missing voices of disabled members of Roma communities, and participants in the focus groups were appreciative of the debate having been brought to the open. Next slide. Music credit, cousin Kenny Kennard. Next slide. There are 5 logos. The logos on the left include the Community Fund, the Shaping Our Lives, and the University of Worcester. The logos on the right side, starting from the top, we see the Centre of Alternative Education and Reintegration for Roma, and the drill logo. Final slide says, a film by Real Master Production and RosaSenCis in the center of the screen.